In this tutorial, we're going to cover some basics on how to get some high quality images for your portfolio. But hold on, before you trash your space and go to the trouble of setting all this stuff up, you may not need to. This may sound obvious, but if you're a digital artist or your artworks are already digitalized, don't go to the trouble of printing and then re-photographing the works. Unless, of course, the printed version of your artworks are where the art lies, like, for example, a photograph that throws a shadow. But if the digital file is sufficient, just skip ahead in this tutorial to the Photoshop portion for some retouching and downsampling assistance. Since we're on the topic of installation views, it may be important to mention that some artworks just simply don't exist outside of installation. They're activated by the space or possibly by the people who came to see it. In this same way, final installation views just might be incomplete without the portfolio reviewer's opportunity to see process shots or possibly process videos to see how this piece came to life. The better you understand your own work, the easier it is to make these sorts of decisions to consider what's in and what's out when you're assembling your portfolio. But if you're photographing flat objects like drawings or paintings or three-dimensional objects, this section of the tutorial will cover some staging, lighting, and camera craft to get you some really high-quality images. Now what I'm setting up right now is essentially a vertical easel. This is the system we use in the studio because it's just, materials that you probably have around the house. I suppose I could probably use the back wall of my room here, but my window is sort of pulled away from the corner. I'm trying to get my artworks out of the shadow. I'm using the big free light source, the sun coming in from outside. That way I don't have to supplement with any other kind of studio lighting. By shimming up the back legs of the ladder, make sure that the ladder is standing nice and straight. This avoids any sort of distortion of the images as I'm setting up the camera later. Now, as long as you've got some really great lighting, I don't want to discount the simplicity of just laying your artwork on the floor and using your smartphone to get some halfway decent images. But if you've got access to a digital SLR camera with some lenses, you might find that the quality of those lens-based images are just going to be a little bit nicer than the ones produced with the wide-angle lens of your smartphone. For works on paper, I recommend just taping it directly to the wall. Use some of that low-tack painter's tape, the blue stuff, and give it maybe just two small pieces of tape on the top two corners. If it just won't lay down flat, go ahead and put a small piece of tape in each corner. With a blower or a clean, soft, bristled brush, remove all the dust so to save yourself the work in Photoshop later. Ideally, you'd set up your camera on a tripod a few feet away and use a normal lens like 50 to 80 millimeters or so. This will give you the least amount of distortion. Now, I probably shouldn't have to say this, but if you're going to photograph your artworks, make sure that you're taking the time to clean off the lenses. This goes for your DSLR and your smartphone lens. Rotate the camera to match the orientation of the artwork, portrait for portrait, landscape for landscape. If your camera gives you the option, set it to shoot in RAW because it'll give us the most options later. Also, set your white balance to work in auto. Then move in as close as you can to make sure that the artwork fills the frame. If you're photographing mounted works or something like a stretched canvas, clamp a piece of wood up to your easel and it'll behave like a rail. This will avoid having to use tape or clamps or any kind of screws or hanging hardware. To get your lens to produce the sharpest possible image, set your f-stop somewhere between f8 and f11 and compensate with your shutter speed. To help out your autofocus, set your focus points to some point of high contrast in the artwork. This DIY system will work reasonably well, even for larger works, but if they get really, really big, you probably want to just set them right on the floor and photograph them in a space large enough that you can get far enough away with the camera. To cut down on distortion, set up your camera to be the height of roughly the dead center of the artwork. You also want to make sure that the camera is not pitched or tilted in any direction, but looking straight at the canvas. If you're having lighting issues, like maybe on a really, really sunny day, use a bounce card to fill the dark side of the image. I prefer this technique to using any sort of supplemental lighting, especially for really delicate artworks like paintings. To photograph three-dimensional objects, you'll need some sort of tabletop and a clean surface to set your objects on. A nice neutral background is great, and make sure that your subject is at least 3 to 5 feet away from the wall. Generally, three-dimensional objects should be photographed from at least a couple different angles, but while you're going to all this trouble, why don't you go ahead and photograph it from a bunch of different angles, from far away and up close. When it comes to retouching these portfolio images, we're going to keep the retouches pretty basic and structural. We're not here to reinvent the artworks. We're only here to present them with as few filters and sort of mediations as possible. So a couple of biggies that come to mind right off the bat would be balancing color, correcting basic exposure problems, and then if there's any rotation issues or distortion, lens distortion issues. So those are the ones I'll address here in this Photoshop tutorial. First up would be color balance. So in camera, if I look over here in my camera raw settings, my white balance says as shot, but because I shot in raw, I could actually go back through all these different camera presets and see if I can kind of get it right. Now, it looks like the vast majority of these aren't going to be anywhere close. I had the camera set to auto because I'm reasonably confident in my camera's ability to get there, but just about every camera will have problems. This whole image has a bit of a blue shift going on because it was kind of a cloudy day outside. So I'll use the eyedropper tool in Camera Raw, and I'll find a mid-tone gray. Just so happens that this bogus paper that I did the drawing on is a reasonably decent mid-tone gray. You'll notice that if I sample something other than a mid-tone gray, the whole image gets readjusted in really weird ways. So whenever I'm selecting my mid-tone gray, make sure you grab something that's as close to a mid-tone as possible. Overall exposure is just a little high, so I'm going to turn the exposure knob down, and typically anything that comes out of the camera could use a little bit of sharpness. So I'll just do it here in Camera Raw here by adding a bit of clarity and dehazing. These two knobs though, or I should say maybe all these sliders, right? It's tempting to just go nuts, but we're reinventing the artwork if you start to add too much of these effects, right? And as fun as this is, we're not here to be digital artists. We're here to sort of reproduce these things with a certain amount of fidelity. In terms of rotational problems and distortion, there are some distortion fixes we can do here in Camera Raw. I'm going to come up here to my lens corrections, and I'll show you where to do it in here, and then also show you how to do it in Photoshop. The lens corrections, according to sort of like a profile correction, would be based on the lens that you were using. So in this case, Photoshop knows that I was shooting with the Nikon AF 50mm 1.8, right? And typically, right, that lens has a certain amount of inherent flaws, and Photoshop has been programmed to resolve them. So the lightness and darkness in the corners, I'm less concerned about, but if you pay really close attention to the artwork as I flip this profile correction on and off, you'll notice that there's a bit of ballooning in the middle of the image. Now, certain lenses have what is called barrel distortion. I'll switch over to a manual correction here and overly exaggerate it. If I had photographed this with a smartphone up close, I would expect this kind of barrel distortion, right? You notice how the nice straight edges of my paper are kind of ballooning out. Now, there's no real great way to fix this or resolve the problem in Photoshop other than to apply the exact opposite kind of distortion, pincushion distortion, right? And so eyeballing this is a little bit dangerous. Instead of eyeballing it, I would say turning on the grid to make sure that your lines end up being straight. In this case, I've got a couple of other problems going on here, like the image isn't rotated correctly. So before I do any lens corrections, I'm actually going to go into Photoshop and correct my rotation first, and then I'll fix the rest of my distortion using filters in Photoshop. I'll click Open Image. And the first thing I'll talk about is sort of the rotation problem. Now, most of the artworks should be sort of photographed square on, but say you got a little sloppy with the camera work and you want to correct the image, turn on your rulers. To do that, the keyboard shortcut is Command R, and in your rulers you can pull down horizontal and vertical guides. The horizontal and vertical guides come in from the left and the right, and say, for example, I want this piece of paper to be sort of squarely aligned with this corner. To do that, I'll set my crop tool, keyboard shortcut C, and one click in the crop tool, and I can hover over the corner here and just sort of rotate the crop until the whole image is squared up to those lines, to those guides. Now, keep in mind here that any rotation in crop, you're going to end up losing a little bit of the photograph. But because we're going to end up cropping most of this down to the edge of the artwork anyway, I'm not super concerned about losing more of the brown. In fact, we're going to lose a little bit extra because of the blue tape in the corners, so not super concerned. My first crop here is purely to get this straight line straight. So you can use another guide here to pull in and accept that crop. And that first sort of straight line edge is looking pretty good. I'm going to hide those guides temporarily by doing Command : and correct for just a little bit of barrel distortion. If I go to Filter, Lens Correction. Now, I sort of prefer to do my lens corrections here using this filter. I'm going to turn the grid on. The grid is going to enable me to sort of see exactly where some of the alignment issues might be in this photograph and exactly where some of the barrel distortion might be. If I come up here to custom distortion, you'll see that I have a whole bunch of potential, problems that the camera may be giving me. I think that there's two problems here. One is a little bit of barrel distortion still, so I'm going to add a little bit of pin cushion distortion to bring the image back. But I also actually have a little horizontal perspective distortion, like I wasn't squarely framed up against the photograph. So if I bring just a tiny little bit of that perspective back, I don't want to distort the image too much, but it basically flattens that image. Ideally, you wouldn't have to do this work in Photoshop. You should just do it in camera, but hey, mistakes happen. So I'll click OK, and you'll notice too that because I did some of those tweaks, that I've lost just a little bit more at the corners. This is why I left a little bit of brown board at the corners of this image anyway, though, so that for each one of these corrections I don't lose too much. Now I'll come back in with my crop tool and recrop this image so that I'm just looking at the artwork. So I'm going to end up losing just a tiny little bit on the edges because of that blue tape, but in this case, there's not a whole lot going on out there that I'm going to miss. So get the crop more or less correct, double click that, and accept the crop. Now I'm looking at a squared up, undistorted version of that image. Now, in some rare cases, you may find that something snuck into the image and is really kind of goofing it up. Like, let's just say some dust landed on the image. This is probably part of the original artwork, but let's just say this little fleck of something there was a dust or a dried booger or something that, was the result of an unskilled photographer. Well, how do we clean that kind of thing up? I would suggest making a duplicate background layer. So Command J to duplicate your layer. Anytime we go into an image and modify it like this, it's a permanent edit. But the patch tool makes for pretty quick work of anything that looks like it might be a mistake or a flaw. I'm going to draw a circle around the flaw and just sort of pull that around. And what I'm looking for now in that tiny little window is a similar value and similar texture. By moving that to a different area of the photograph, Command D, I've removed that little fleck. And if I turn that layer on and off, you can see the original photograph and the edited. So as long as you're only zooming in maybe a couple 100%, you're not going to be editing pixel by pixel kind of stuff. But I'll do one more example down here. I'm doing a Command +++ to zoom in, and I'll draw a little circle around this flaw here in the artwork and find a good spot to just sort of blend that away. Keep in mind here, guys, we're not being digital artists. We're just trying to be truthful to the original artwork. So don't reinvent it. Just kind of get it presentation ready. Now, since we've done a decent amount of work to this image, we spent time photographing it in the studio, and now we've spent time editing in Photoshop, I want you to save what's called a good working copy. To do this, we'll do a File, Save As. And working copies or raw copies are going to be the highest possible quality. So this would be your PSD file or Photoshop file. It's going to save any layery work you did in here, and it won't compress your file at all. Name it the title of the artwork. Probably not a bad idea that if this is going to be sent off somewhere too, to put your name in there. Just one more way to connect you to your artworks. But this will kind of become the unedited or undownsampled original file. And you would click Save to make sure you're paying attention to where these images are going. But now that we're at the very back end of these edits, right, it comes time to downsample works, right? You almost never send full high-resolution quality images in for a portfolio, whether that's a college application or a grant scholarship or an artist residency or anything that you would be submitting a portfolio for. They're going to have size limits, so you're going to end up having to downsample your images. Let's take a look and see how big this image is for starters, and then we'll talk about how to downsample it. So if I go to Image Size, I made an image on my digital SLR here to get this photograph, and it's coming out at a 300 DPI image and about a 13.5 inch by 6 inch photograph. Now those are two different sizes to pay attention to. One of them has to do with the resolution quality, and one of them is the physical size. Both of those added together basically will produce the overall file size. Maybe the most basic way of thinking about this is how many pixels are in the image. You can get your pixel dimensions here and multiply them, and that basically will end up into this 22.2 meg file. It's a huge file, right? Typically, file submissions are between 2 and 5 megs max, so we got to get this 22 down quite a bit. Now, just saving this file out as a JPEG will shrink this file size significantly. But if it doesn't, if you're still oversized when you export it as a JPEG, there's a couple things we can do right here in image size to reduce the size. Now, 300 dpi is considered full resolution for print, but for screen, there's really no point in being much higher than 72 dpi. If you really want to fuss about it, reduce that 300 resolution to 150. Now, in this case, I had resample checked, and so as I shrunk that resolution, you notice that the whole image didn't change its physical size, but it has significantly reduced its footprint on the hard drive from 22 megs down to 5.56 megs. So I'm going to go back here and do that again, but this time uncheck resample. And I want you to watch what happens to the physical dimensions of this image. I'm going to reduce it to 150 dpi, and as I went down in resolution, my physical size went up. This would be the case if I went down to screen resolutions, which are, for the most part, 72 dpi, and the physical dimensions go up and up and up and up and up. I actually haven't downsampled this image yet. If I'm going to truly downsample this image, I have to make sure that resample is checked. So I'm going to come back in here, reset that resolution to 150 dpi. Then I'll come back in and resample it, and I'll knock this file size down significantly. Maybe in its longest dimension, I'll make it 10 inches. So I've resampled this whole image down from 22 megs to a 3 meg file. Now this is even before JPEG compression, so the JPEG compression will further reduce this. If the place that you're sending your images to has pixel dimension limitations, this is also a great place where you can just check in and take a look right at those pixel dimensions. I'm going to click OK, do a file save as, and in this case, I'm going to change the name here, call it Portfolio 1 for now, and I'm going to change my format to JPEG. Compressing as a JPEG file is going to reduce the file size even further. When I click Save again, I get one last image option here. Make sure you're saving a full resolution JPEG. Unless you have really extreme size limitations on these files, I would never downsample using my JPEG compression, and click OK. Now keep in mind, I was just working with a pretty gigantic file, 22 megs, and we're going to jump out of Photoshop now to take a look and see how large of a file that actually got reduced to. So this one was renamed Portfolio 1. I went from 22 megs to 1 meg. If I do a quick preview on that, you'll notice that even at a 1 meg file here on screen, that's still a reasonably high resolution file for looking at screens. I wouldn't necessarily want to do a print version of this thing with that low of a downsample, but it's still a fairly high resolution image. And finally here at the end, just for the sake of sort of being a good file manager, I want to take a look at the way that these three files have saved. So originally, right out of the camera, I've got my NEF file, the raw file that came from the DSLR at 30 megs or so. Then I've got my working copy, the PSD file, which is my uncompressed edited version that I spent all that time with working in Photoshop at 70 megs. And then when it comes time to submitting for the portfolio, I've got a reduced or downsampled file size with my name, the title, and the date right into the file name, and it's reduced down to a 1 meg file type. That's small enough that that could be emailed out or uploaded to any kinds of portfolios.